The case of Tiffany Meek begins in a seemingly ordinary setting, but it quickly turns into one of the most shocking recent criminal stories in South Africa. Everything revolves around the death of the boy, Jaden Lee Mika, Chideng, only 11 years old, a child who, until then, lived what was considered a normal routine within his community. They lived in Fleurhof, a residential area near Johannesburg, marked by housing complexes and a relatively quiet urban life where neighbors often know each other and daily life follows predictable patterns. Within this context, nothing at first glance indicated that this environment would become the stage for such an intense criminal investigation. What makes the case especially impactful from the beginning is not only the death of a child, but the fact that suspicion quickly turned inward, toward the home itself, breaking the basic expectation that the home is a place of protection. Cases involving close family members tend to generate a different kind of public reaction, precisely because they challenge this idea of domestic safety, and that is exactly what happened here. As the first pieces of information began to emerge, the story stopped being just a possible child disappearance and started to take on much more serious contours, attracting the attention of the media, authorities, and the public. The name Tiffany Meek then began to occupy a central place in the narrative, not only as the victim's mother, but as a key figure in an investigation that was still in its early stages. The case began to raise questions about what had really happened in the days leading up to the boy's disappearance, what the circumstances were inside the family environment, and whether there had been any prior signs that could indicate some kind of problem. This kind of initial reconstruction is common in criminal investigations, especially when there is no clear and immediate explanation for what happened. At the same time, the case's impact continued to grow because it brings together elements that historically generate strong public reaction: a young victim, suspicious circumstances, and possible inconsistencies in the initial versions presented. This caused media coverage to expand rapidly, following each new detail released by authorities. Even in the early stages, before all the evidence came to light, it was already possible to see that this was not a simple or isolated case, but a complex situation that would require a thorough investigation. Thus, what can be considered part 1 of this case establishes itself as the starting point of a story that begins with an apparently ordinary routine and evolves into a scenario of suspicion, tension, and growing public attention, where every detail starts to be carefully examined, while authorities try to understand exactly what happened to Jaden Lee and what role his own mother may have played in this entire tragedy. The second part of the case of Tiffany Meek begins at the moment when the seemingly ordinary routine is abruptly broken. The disappearance of Jaden Lee Mika. In May 2025, the boy did not return home at the time he normally would after school, which immediately raised concern. In situations like this, especially involving children, every minute matters, and an absence outside the usual pattern quickly draws the attention of family members and neighbors. It was precisely this break from routine that triggered an initial mobilization within the residential complex in Fleurhof near Johannesburg. In the first moments, the case did not yet have clearly defined criminal contours. The priority was to locate the boy, and reports indicate that searches were carried out in common areas of the complex, including staircases, corridors, and surrounding spaces, places where a child might be if something had happened on the way home. This type of immediate response is common in residential communities, where residents often come together in urgent situations. The initial expectation, as in many similar cases, was that it could be a temporary disappearance or some still unknown circumstance, but not necessarily a violent one. As the hours passed without any confirmation of Jaden Lee's whereabouts, the situation began to take on a more serious tone. The prolonged absence raised the level of alert, and authorities were called in to begin formal search procedures. At this stage, investigations typically focus on reconstructing the victim's last known movements, the time he left school, possible witnesses, routes taken, and any relevant interactions recorded before the disappearance. This information is essential to determine whether there was a deviation from his usual path, contact with third parties, or any unusual event. Another important point in this early phase was the collection of statements, including that of his own mother. In cases involving minors, close family members are always a primary source of information, as they are familiar with the child's routine, habits, and any behavioral changes. However, even at this stage, questions began to arise about the consistency of some of the information provided. While this is not uncommon in investigations, since memory can be affected under stress, it can become significant when compared with other gathered evidence. Meanwhile, the local community began to follow the case with growing concern. Child disappearances tend to generate strong social reactions, driven by both fear and empathy. The possibility that something serious might have occurred within what was considered a safe environment started to shift public perception. What might initially have been seen as an isolated incident began to raise more troubling hypotheses, even before any official confirmation. As the search efforts progressed and clear answers remained absent, the case was no longer treated as a simple disappearance. The combination of time without locating the boy, perceived inconsistencies, and the lack of concrete explanations began to steer the investigation toward a more complex scenario. This period, still before the discovery of the body, is crucial to understanding how the narrative quickly evolved from concern to suspicion, setting the stage for the decisive turning point that would follow. Thus, Part 2 establishes itself as the moment when Jaden Lee's disappearance stops being merely an uncertain situation and begins to carry signs that something more serious could be behind it, marking the beginning of an investigation that would become increasingly intense and detailed. The third part of the case of Kimessa Tiffany Meek marks the near point where uncertainty gives way to a far more disturbing reality. After a full period of searching with no confirmed sighting of Jaden Lee Meek, the situation reached a turning point when his body was discovered within the same residential complex where he lived, in Florhofang, near Johannesburg. The location of the discovery, reportedly near a staircase inside the complex, immediately raised serious concerns for investigators, as it suggested that whatever had happened likely occurred very close to home. This moment fundamentally changed the nature of the case. What had been treated as a missing child investigation was instantly reclassified as a homicide inquiry. The presence of the body within the residential environment narrowed the scope of possibilities and shifted investigative focus toward individuals who had direct or indirect access to the premises. In criminal investigations, location is often one of the most critical elements, and finding the victim so close to home tends to reduce the likelihood of random external involvement while increasing scrutiny on the immediate surroundings. Authorities began a detailed forensic examination of the scene. Although not all findings were publicly disclosed, standard procedure in such cases includes analyzing physical evidence, potential signs of struggle, cause and time of death, and any indicators that could help reconstruct the sequence of events. The fact that the body was not found outside the broader area but within the same complex added a layer of complexity, raising questions about whether the incident had been concealed, staged, or simply not immediately discovered during initial searches. At the same time, investigators revisited earlier statements and timelines. Once a case shifts from disappearance to confirmed death, every prior detail becomes more significant. Statements that may have seemed minor or inconclusive before are re-examined under a different lens, often compared against emerging forensic evidence. Inconsistencies, even small ones, can gain weight when placed alongside physical findings, and this is typically when investigative pressure begins to intensify. The emotional impact on the community also deepened at this stage. The discovery of a child's body, particularly in such close proximity to his home, tends to amplify fear and grief. Residents who had participated in searches or followed developments closely were now confronted with a tragic outcome. The idea that the event occurred within a familiar and shared living space made the situation even more unsettling, reinforcing the sense that the case was not only tragic but deeply personal for those nearby. Media attention expanded significantly following this development. The narrative shifted from hope for a safe return to questions about responsibility, motive, and accountability. Cases involving children often receive heightened coverage, but the added element of proximity to home and emerging suspicions made this case especially compelling to the public. Each update began to carry greater weight as audiences sought to understand how such an ghutna could have unfolded under seemingly ordinary circumstances. This phase also represents the point at which investigative direction becomes more defined. With the confirmation of death, authorities can move beyond search efforts and focus on building a legal case. This includes identifying potential suspects, gathering admissible evidence, and preparing for possible charges. The transition from uncertainty to confirmed homicide is one of the most critical junctures in any criminal case, and in this situation, it set in motion the silsilat of developments that would eventually lead to an arrest. The fourth part of the case of Tiffany Nicole Meek represents the phase in which the investigation becomes more focused, methodical, and legally structured, moving beyond the shock of discovery into the process of identifying responsibility. After the body of Jaden Lee Meek was found in Martin Fleurhof near Johannesburg, investigators intensified their efforts to reconstruct in as much detail as possible the final hours and movements of the child. This stage is often one of the most critical in any homicide case, because it is where timelines are solidified, contradictions are tested, and evidence begins to be organized into a coherent narrative that can eventually stand in court. Authorities would have worked to establish a precise sequence of events when Jaden Lee was last seen alive, who had contact with him, what routes he may have taken, and whether any unusual activity was observed within the residential complex. Surveillance possibilities, witness accounts, and environmental factors all become essential in building this timeline. In residential settings like Fleurhof, where movement is somewhat contained, even small observations, such as someone entering or leaving a specific area at an unusual time, can carry significant weight. As the timeline became clearer, attention increasingly turned toward the immediate domestic environment. In cases where a victim is found close to home, investigators often prioritize individuals with direct access and proximity, not as a presumption of guilt, but because statistical patterns and practical reasoning make them central to the inquiry. Within this context, the role of Tiffany Meek shifted from that of a grieving parent providing information to that of a key figure whose statements and actions required careful verification. Reports indicated that investigators identified inconsistencies between different accounts and the emerging evidence. These inconsistencies do not automatically establish guilt, but they do trigger deeper scrutiny. Statements are typically cross-referenced with forensic findings, timelines, and independent witness testimony. When discrepancies persist, they can become a significant factor in determining the direction of the case. It is during this phase that investigative pressure tends to increase, as authorities seek clarity on points that do not align. Another important dimension of this stage involves forensic analysis. Although full forensic details are not always made public, such examinations generally aim to determine cause of death, approximate time of death, and whether there were signs of struggle or external involvement. These findings help either support or contradict the narratives provided by individuals connected to the victim. When forensic evidence and personal accounts diverge, it often becomes a pivotal element in the case. At the same time, legal considerations begin to shape the investigation more directly. Detectives must ensure that evidence is collected and handled in a way that will be admissible in court. This includes maintaining proper procedures, documenting every step, and avoiding contamination or procedural errors. The case is no longer just about understanding what happened. It is about proving it within the strict framework of the legal system. Public attention continued to grow during this phase, driven by the unsettling nature of the case. The idea that the truth might lie within the household itself intensified media coverage and public speculation. However, authorities are typically cautious about what they disclose at this stage, balancing the need for transparency with the need to protect the integrity of the investigation. As a result, information released to the public often comes in controlled updates, leaving gaps that further fuel curiosity and concern. Gradually, the accumulation of evidence, combined with the evaluation of statements and behavior, led investigators toward a more defined conclusion about who might be responsible. This is the stage where suspicion transitions into actionable grounds for arrest. While the exact threshold varies depending on jurisdiction, it generally requires sufficient evidence to justify formal charges and legal detention. The fourth part of the case of Tiffany Nicole Meek deepens into the most decisive and complex phase of the investigation, where uncertainty is gradually replaced by structured conclusions built from accumulated evidence, cross-checked timelines, and increasing investigative pressure. Following the discovery of the body of Jaden Lee Meek of Indidiweka in 330 Fleurhof near Johannesburg in Nikakos, the case no longer revolved around what happened in a general sense, but rather how exactly it happened and, more critically, who is legally responsible. This shift marks the transition from reactive investigation to targeted case building. At this stage, investigators typically begin to reconstruct the final timeline with extreme precision, often narrowing events down to specific windows of minutes rather than hours. Every known movement of Jaden Lee becomes essential. When he was last seen, who might have interacted with him, what physical paths he could have taken within the residential complex, and whether any deviations from routine can be verified through witness accounts or environmental clues. In a contained setting like Fleurhof, where entry and exit points are relatively limited, even small gaps in the timeline can become highly significant, as they may indicate moments where something critical occurred. Simultaneously, the focus on the domestic environment intensifies further. In many homicide investigations, especially those involving children found close to home, authorities concentrate on individuals with the closest proximity, access, and opportunity. Within this framework, Tiffany Meek's role becomes central not only emotionally but investigatively. Her statements, timelines, and reported actions are examined in detail, often compared against physical evidence and independent accounts. Investigators may revisit earlier interviews multiple times, looking for consistency, clarification, or contradictions that could reveal whether the narrative provided aligns with the emerging facts. It is during this process that reported inconsistencies began to carry more weight. While discrepancies alone do not prove guilt, they can indicate that certain elements of the story require deeper scrutiny. Investigators typically analyze whether differences in statements are due to stress, confusion, or something more deliberate. When inconsistencies align with gaps in the timeline or conflict with forensic findings, they can significantly influence the direction of the case. This phase is often marked by a tightening circle of focus, where possibilities are gradually eliminated and attention converges on fewer, more specific scenarios. Forensic analysis plays a crucial role in reinforcing or challenging these developing conclusions. Although many details are not publicly disclosed, standard forensic procedures would include determining the cause of death, estimating the time frame in which it occurred, and identifying any physical evidence that could indicate the manner in which the ghutna took place. This may involve examination of the scene, the body, and any relevant objects within the environment. The relationship between forensic findings and personal accounts becomes especially important. When they align, they strengthen the narrative, and when they diverge, they raise critical questions that must be resolved. At the same time, investigators must operate within strict legal boundaries. Every piece of evidence must be collected, documented, and preserved according to legal standards to ensure it can be presented in court. This includes maintaining clear chains of custody, properly recording interviews, and avoiding any procedural missteps that could compromise the case. The investigation is no longer only about discovering the truth. It is about building a case that can withstand legal scrutiny and lead to a prosecutable outcome. As the evidence base grows, so does the level of investigative confidence. Patterns begin to emerge, timelines become more coherent, and the overall picture starts to take shape. This is typically the point at which authorities evaluate whether there is sufficient evidence to move forward with formal legal action. The threshold for this decision is significant. It requires not just suspicion, but a reasonable basis to believe that a specific individual is responsible, supported by evidence that can be defended in court. Public and media attention remain intense throughout this phase, but official communication often becomes more controlled. Authorities tend to release limited information, both to protect the integrity of the investigation and to avoid influencing potential witnesses or future legal proceedings. This controlled flow of information can create an environment where speculation increases, but behind the scenes, the case is becoming increasingly defined and structured. Ultimately, this stage culminates in the moment where investigation transitions into prosecution. The accumulation of forensic evidence, analyzed timelines, and scrutinized statements leads to a point where authorities are prepared to act. In this case, it sets the foundation for the arrest and formal charging of Tiffany Meek, marking a critical turning point where the focus shifts from uncovering events to proving them within the judicial system.